In Duel, Steven Spielberg's small-screen masterpiece, David Mann never wanted to be fast. He wanted to disappear, to blend in, to drive a car that said nothing about him at all. But somewhere out there on a two-lane highway, he learned an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes anonymity isn't protection. Sometimes it's an invitation. When the road turns empty, when the rear mirror fills with menacing steel, and there's nowhere to pull off, nowhere to hide, what saves you isn't flash. It isn't a badge in the fender, it's torque. Quiet, immediate, unquestioned power. The kind you never advertise. The kind you only use when you have to. Because the safest car on the highway isn't the loudest one. It's the one no one expects to outrun the threat. On Reel Rides Reimagined, we take movie cars that deserved better and rebuild them using inspiration from other films, real car logic, and a little AI help. In this episode, we are giving David Mann a car that can outrun the most menacing of 18-wheelers. Hey there, car guys and movie buffs. Welcome to Reel Rides Reimagined. I'm your host, Deva. In this episode, we pair Duel with the original 1974 Gone in 60 Seconds. Neither story is really about cars. They're about professionals operating under pressure. And professionals don't choose loud cars. In Gone in 60 Seconds, the thieves don't want attention. They don't want to be remembered. They want cars that start, that move, and that blend into traffic. The goal is to leave the scene before anyone realizes something is amiss. David Mann isn't a thief, but he's facing the same problem. How do you survive when you become a target? Their answer is not to blend in, it's to check out. The car that looks ordinary, practically invisible, but harbors a no-nonsense power plant capable of putting distance between you and your rival in seconds. In 1971, Duel began life as a made-for-television movie, the kind of project designed to fill a time slot, not make history. But what Steven Spielberg delivered was so effective that it outgrew television and eventually earned theatrical release around the world. This is a psychological thriller with almost no dialogue, almost no score, and essentially one human character on screen for most of the film. I remember watching Duel on television when I was young. Yeah, I was young once. And yes, I did watch this movie on the small screen. I remember being genuinely confused about what I was seeing. How could this possibly work? A truck, a salesman, and a dusty road. That's it. That's the movie. But it did work. It was captivating. Looking back, it's one of the earliest clear signals of Steven Spielberg's genius as a filmmaker. Jaws would take the same basic idea, replace the truck with a shark, replace David Mann with Hooper, Quint, and Sheriff Brody, and scale it up for theaters. And I'm pretty sure that truck was easier to direct than that mechanical shark. The main character in Duel is David Mann, played by Dennis Weaver, one of those actors who seemed to be everywhere in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Weaver had a gift for playing ordinary men under pressure, and Duel may be the purest distillation of that talent. The story is deceptively simple. A mild-mannered salesman driving across the California desert makes a small decision on a two-lane road, and that decision haunts him for the rest of the film. What follows isn't a chase so much as an escalation. A slow tightening of the vise as a massive anonymous tanker truck begins to assert control over the road. The tanker harasses and intimidates David for mile after mile, apparently for the pure sadistic fun of it. Spielberg turns the truck into something more than a vehicle. It's never explained or humanized. It doesn't need to be. Its size, sound, and dogged persistence are enough. What makes Duel remarkable, especially for its era, is how little it relies on spectacle. The tension comes from timing and from framing, and from the growing realization that Mann's car is simply outmatched. There's no mystery to solve, no villain speech. Just a man, a machine, and the creeping understanding that politeness is not a defense when power is unevenly distributed. For this episode, we deliberately chose the original Gone in 60 Seconds. Not because the remake isn't great, it is. Because it's a different kind of movie. The 1974 is rougher and gritty, and far more honest about risk. This version was written, directed, produced, and starred H.B. Halicki, a professional stuntman who didn't simulate danger. He embraced it like a blonde-haired, blue-eyed favorite son. The stunts in this film aren't clean or elegant. They're violent, improvised, and often destructive. The cars slide, careen, and crash like a nightmare 1970s version of Mario Kart. The plot is simple and relentless. A crew is tasked with stealing dozens of cars in a narrow window of time, not for glory or bravado, but because the job demands it. This isn't about one hero car. Yes, Eleanor, the yellow Mustang, gets remembered, but the soul of the film is the volume. Dozens of classic American cars, taken quietly, quickly, and without ceremony. What the movie captures better than almost any other car film is Grand Theft Auto as logistics. Planning, timing, redundancy. The cars are tools to achieve an end, and the best tool is the one that doesn't attract attention, till there's no choice. David Mann's car is a 1971 Plymouth Valiant. Word is that Spielberg chose red so it would pop against the desert. But the choice of a Valiant went deeper than color. In the early 1970s, the Valiant wasn't just sensible. It was a rolling white flag. It was the choice of a man who had traded his agency for middle management security, a symbol of a domestic, emasculated existence where survival meant following the rules and never making a sound. Under the hood was the Slant-6. It's a legendary engine, but in this context, its reliability is a trap. Chrysler built variations of the Slant-6 for more than 4 decades, from the early 1960s into the 2000s. Taxi fleets and delivery vehicles loved them. It earned a reputation as one of the most reliable engines ever put into mass production. Yep, it's an engine that will keep you running forever, but it won't allow you to fight back. It reflects Mann himself, capable of enduring the harassment, but biologically incapable of ending it. In Duel, Mann isn't just running from a truck. He's running from the realization that he's built a life and a car that has no teeth. And that's the point. Mann isn't driving a bad car. He's driving a good car, one optimized for longevity, economy, and restraint. What Duel exposes is the limit of that philosophy. Reliability gets you from A to B, but it doesn't give you authority. And when the threat behind you has more weight, more power, and more patience, reliability alone isn't enough. So here we are giving David Mann his teeth back, but we're doing it with a budget-conscious professional mindset, the kind of build a thief from Gone in 60 Seconds would respect. High impact, but with controlled costs. H.B. Halicki understood something most directors don't. For a professional car thief, a car isn't an extension of your ego. It's a logistical asset. The thieves in this film don't want a hero car that draws every eye on the block. They want a car that disappears into the sea of brown and beige traffic, yet possesses the mechanical backbone to survive a violent, improvised escape. When we look at David Mann's fixer build, we're looking at it through Halicki's eyes. We're building a Charger. A professional thief would spot a Charger and see it as an ultimate score. It's plain Jane, unassuming enough to sit in a motel parking lot without a second glance. Yet it's hiding a high-torque 440 that makes it a formidable getaway vehicle. We built David Mann a car that a thief would steal in a heartbeat, not because it's flashy, but because it's capable. What's remarkable about the original Gone in 60 Seconds isn't any single car. It's the sheer number of them. Dozens of classic American cars pass through the film. Mustangs, Cadillacs, Pontiacs, Lincolns, each selected not for personality, but for opportunity. This is one of those movies that I'd love to time travel back to, not to save the cars, but just to watch them pass by. Because what the film captures, almost accidentally, is a rolling catalog of American iron before it became precious. The remarkable thing is how ordinary they treated those pieces of art. They aren't pampered or protected, and they certainly aren't worshipped. Yes, Eleanor, the yellow Mustang, stands out. But even she isn't special because she's beautiful. She's special because she's difficult, because she resists, and because she tests the limits of the system trying to control her. In this movie, cars aren't expressions of identity. They're functional. The best car is the one that gets the job done without asking to be remembered. So this is where the two films meet. Not in style, not in theme, but in intent. We give David Mann a no-frills 1971 Charger, a base Charger with no outward signs of performance. Why a Charger? Well, for one, it's a Mopar, just like the Duel movie car. Second, it's a car that looks like it belongs in the background, parked at a motel, idling at a rest stop, just another car passing through. Something a salesman might drive in 1974, getting unpretentiously from sales meeting 1 to sales meeting 2. We didn't choose the Charger because it appeared in Gone in 60 Seconds. We chose it because it's exactly the kind of unremarkable yet desirable cars that the Gone in 60 thieves would steal. Ordinary, yet torque-rich. A car a salesman would pick, and a car a professional thief would recognize as an easy mark. Easy to get away with quietly, and easy to sell to an unsuspecting buyer. We paint it Dusty Rose, not because the Valiant was Dusty Rose, but because that is how I remember the Valiant before a rewatch. In my memory, the Valiant was Dusty Rose, even though on a rewatch, I see that it's a brighter orange red. I think I was remembering the ending where the car is covered in dust, making it look Dusty Rose. Whatever. I'm going with memory over eyesight. Dusty Rose is a better color. Otherwise, the Charger is salesman plain Jane. No stripes, no badges, nothing to announce itself. But underneath, we abandon the constraint. I'm dialing up a Chrysler 440 under the hood, built to look exactly like it could have come this way, yet quietly modernized because custom means modern. And despite the plain Jane motif, this car is custom. We start with electric fuel injection, hidden in plain sight under the factory air cleaner. Reliable starts, smooth cruising, and a fighting chance at decent gas mileage for that Mopar big block, because this is still a salesman's car. The gearing is tall. Yes, there's torque, but we've tamed it. This isn't about drama off the line. It's about getaway authority at highway speed, the ability to pass, to pull away, and to escape a situation without turning it into a scene. We'll update the suspension with tubular control arms and coilovers up front, and a torsion bar for our stability. We'll refresh the leaf springs in the rear and add some quality gas shocks. If we're feeling especially feisty, we'll update the steering box and convert to power disc brakes. My preference is for a manual transmission, but an automatic would work just as well. Our only external indulgence is black rims with slightly oversized tires in the rear. Even a salesman has to live a little once in a while. We'll keep the interior stock and just refresh and update as necessary to keep the interior like new to match the exterior. Okay, so what's this thing going to cost? I hope you realize by now that I tend to estimate on the high side. I do that because experience has taught me that when building cars, there is no high side. The high side inevitably becomes the amount at the bottom of the invoices. If you plan high, then well, anything below that feels like a victory. So for our David Mann build, we start with a decent builder car. I'm budgeting 18 to 22K for a builder car. Worst case scenario, we might have to go for a 72 to 74 model if we can't find a decent 71 for that price. Here's a rundown of my estimate for the rest of the build. For the powertrain, a rebuilt Chrysler 440 big block, $4,500 to $6,000. We add a hidden EFI system, $2,800 to $3,200, including tank and electric fuel pump. In the back, a limited slip differential, maybe up to $1,500. Suspension upgrades, tubular control arms, coilovers, and gas shocks, maybe $2,800 to $3,000. Disc conversion and modern steering box, $1,500 to $2,000. For paint and body, our Dusty Rose driver quality respray and prep, we're aiming for $5,000 to $8,000. The interior gets a stock refresh with seats, covers, dash pad, and fresh carpet, $1,800 to $2,500. We find some nice black wheels and add oversized rubber, $2,200 to $2,600. Total build estimate, $39,000 to maybe up to $50K. Not bad given the asking prices I see online. I think David Mann would be happy to spend $50K for a car that blends in, provides enough power to achieve escape velocity, and it can impress the Mopar guys all at the same time. Well, that's it for this episode. If you like this stuff, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button. I'm having a ball putting these things together, but I sure like to earn some building dough. 27 grand for a plain Jane Charger doesn't grow on trees. Oh, and if you want to call my ideas AI slop or some other pejorative, go right ahead. YouTube counts that as engagement. YouTube loves engagement. Just don't expect me to argue with you in the comments. I got cars to build. This is Deva, saying goodnight.